Hello, my excellent biologists. Today we are going to do part 2 of chapter 34. So what we have already discussed in part 1 is we talked about all the biotic factors of ecosystems. And remember, biotic means living, right? Those living factors. And we talked about how the energy flows through them. And we talked about trophic levels and ecological pyramids. And today in part 2, we're going to talk about how nutrients cycle, right? Energy flows and nutrient cycles. So we're going to talk about 4 main biogeochemical cycles. And I'm in the way here. Here we go. So this is part 2. And for those of you, if you're watching it on YouTube, you can have access to the notes that my students have. They're in the description of the video, and there will be a link in those notes to these slides that I'm using today. Okay, so these biogeochemical cycles, here's a few of them, right? We've got the water cycle, the carbon cycle is represented here, the nitrogen cycle. The only one that's not in this picture is the phosphorus cycle, and we'll be talking about that as well. So when you talk about all of these cycles, there's like 3 parts where you can find these important chemicals. So let me start with the community, okay? So the community is that biotic community, those food chains, those food webs. And so you could have a carbon in a living organism, right? And those organisms can move from producers then to consumers, and then decomposers work on the producers and the consumers when they die, and they will return those nutrients, right, to where a producer can access it again. And when you talk about where producers or autotrophs get those nutrients, that's called the exchange pool, okay? So autotrophs access carbon, phosphorus from the exchange pool, and then it can move through the rest of the biotic community. Now, what the reservoir is where that particular element is stored. So for instance, the reservoir for carbon, that could be, let's say, in oil, right? Or it could be in the shells of dead sea creatures, right, at the bottom of the ocean. So the producers, the autotrophs, can't access it from the shells. They need it to be dissolved in the water as bicarbonate. So what all bicarbonate is when you, just like when you dissolve sugar into coffee, when you dissolve CO2 into water, it becomes bicarbonate, HCO3 minus. The exchange pool, right, then they can get it out of the water, and then once it's in autotrophs, it can move through that biotic community. Other reservoirs for like the phosphorus cycle, the reservoir for that is in rocks. So to get it into the exchange pool where plants can have access to it, you need to have things like weathering to get it into the exchange pool. So on your notes where it says components, the reservoir is the storehouse for the chemical. The storehouse for the chemical. And you might want to add on there that it's unavailable to producers or autotrophs. The exchange pool is where autotrophs access the chemical, And then the biotic community is how chemicals move through food chains, how the chemicals move through those food chains and food webs. And remember, for the notes that I provide for you, column 1 is the scaffolding. Wherever you see yellow highlights, that's where you're typing in the words that I'm giving you right now. Column 2, remember, you're throwing in pictures to help you remember the content, right? So you could go and capture this picture from the Google Slides that I gave you, or some other picture on the internet that helps you with that. Okay, on the types of cycles, you have some that are primarily gaseous, like you think of carbon being in the air. You think of carbon being in the air, and then you have to bring it out of the air, right? And when we talk about that, that's carbon fixation, and that's what plants do through photosynthesis. They can remove the CO2 out of the air where it's a gas, and then they can make it a solid, ultimately forming sugars. So carbon and nitrogen are primarily gaseous cycles. Nitrogen fixation takes place by nitrogen fixing bacteria. They take it out of the air, right, and make it available ultimately with other nitrifying bacteria to plants. Other cycles are if you are primarily sedimentary, like the phosphorus cycle is a sedimentary cycle. Now, all of these cycles Okay, all of these cycles that we talk about, we will also talk about man's impact on those cycles. And generally speaking, we have a negative impact on all of these cycles. And we will be discussing that as we go through it. Okay, but that's a choice, right? We can do something about that. All right, so let's start with easy peasy is the water cycle, right? We can't live without water. Our cells are primarily water. So water can be found underground, like in aquifers, in the atmosphere, ice caps, lakes, and streams. But the scary part of the water cycle is of all the water on this planet, right? 3/4 of this earth is covered with water in just oceans. Of all the water on this planet, only 3% is fresh water. And of that 3%, most of it is not in a liquid water form that we would easily access. Most of that 3% is locked up in glaciers. Now, I don't want you to think that I'm saying glaciers are a bad thing. Glaciers are a good thing. And the melting of glaciers is causing tremendous problems and affecting weather systems. So we still want our glaciers. I'm just giving you the information that there's very little fresh water on this planet. And so we should really, really take care of the fresh water that we have, right? So let's just review the water cycle. Take a minute and look at this. You probably learned this in like kindergarten, right? So let's just go over a few of those words. I'll start over on the right of the cycle and you can kind of follow me around. So water going up into the air, that's called evaporation, when it evaporates out of bodies of water like lakes or out of the ocean, right? Evapotranspiration, or just transpiration, is when water evaporates out of plants. Now, the way it does that is there are little openings in the plant leaves or herbaceous stems called stomata, and so the water will evaporate out of those. Now, that's a critical part of plant physiology, and I'll put a pin in that because we're going to come back to that at a later time. But for right now, you just need to know that water is evaporating out those open stomata, and it's getting into the atmosphere. Now, if it condenses, it can condense into clouds, right? And then from there, you can do precipitation, where it returns back to the Earth's surface, right? Through, it can collect in bodies of water. It can collect underground in aquifers as well. You can have runoff, right? So on the water cycle, you have those terms, evaporation and precipitation, and then some specific terms, transpiration. Transpiration is the evaporation of water from plants. The evaporation of water from plants. Aquifers are underground storage of fresh water. So water, if you live in North America, water is easily accessible. You just turn on your tap and boom, water is going to come out of it. But in many, many places of the country, water is not easily accessible. They cannot afford to turn on sprinklers and water their grass so that their yard looks pretty. They're trying to find some water so they can drink it, so they can stay alive. And you can look at this water right here. Just look at the color of it. Would you drink that water? No, you would not, right? So they still have to use energy to clean that water, right? To boil that water and collect that water. So we need to think about bigger than ourselves and the world and the environment that we live in. And oftentimes water is not easily accessible. And then on top of that, those pollutants. And when we pollute our water, right? Water from the oceans are all interconnected. It's not going to stay right there. It's going to move all over. Another serious problem is we have droughts, serious droughts, right? We have some of the hottest years on record are getting recorded. And as a result, we're not getting the rain that we need. So farmers are having to pull water out of wells again and again. And those underground water beds are called aquifers. Those aquifers act as, like, think about a water balloon or a water bed. That would be better. Think about a water bed, right? You can sleep on that water bed because there's water in that sack below it. If you drain the water, right, it'll fall and you would fall. And so what happens is as the water gets drained, then you don't have that supportive material and it can cause huge sinkholes, and sinkholes are bad. All right. So on human activities, you want to write only 3% of the world's water is fresh water, and oftentimes we are polluting that. Hashtag poor choices. Groundwater mining, when water withdrawal from aquifers exceeds its replenishment, and it can cause sinkholes. Okay. One cycle down, 3 to go. So the next one we're going to talk about is the phosphorus cycle. Just take a minute to look at it. Look at the picture. Look at the water cycle impacting this cycle. Okay, look at all in the water. You can see that. You can see it moving through plants and animals, right? So the reservoir for the phosphorus cycle is in rocks. And then to get it out of the rocks, you have things like weathering, and then that can get it into the soil or into bodies of water. Then that exchange pool is where the producers can pick it up. And so then the phosphorus moves into the producers, and then consumers, heterotrophs, can eat the producers, and now the phosphorus is in them. When the producers and consumers die, decomposers can put it back into the exchange pool. And if there's sedimentation, then it can go back into new rocks, and then it would then be back into the reservoir, right? So phosphorus is what's called a limiting factor in plant growth. It kind of keeps it in check, because plants can't grow if it doesn't have phosphorus. So that's why it's called a limiting factor. So on your notes, steps, weathering from the reservoir, that's rocks, that's what gets it in to the exchange pool. It is a limiting nutrient, that's what goes in your notes. So it's usually immediately incorporated by autotrophs and then moves into heterotrophs. So the problem would be is this, remember what this means, right? Maintaining homeostasis. So it can be in balance. Anything that puts it out of balance can cause some serious problems. So if we add too much phosphorus, okay, due to runoff from farms, due to runoff from cattle, waste and pollutants, then this can cause over-enrichment of a body of water. So just, you can follow kind of the arrows out there. So cars and factories, natural runoff, manure runoff from if you're fertilizing your yard and then you have runoff. Now, I'm not saying fertilizing your yard is bad. Over-fertilizing is though, right? Runoff from streets, runoff from erosion, from factories. All of these things can now all of a sudden make phosphorus not a limiting factor. So then you can get a lot of plants growing. And you might say, well, Mrs. Sloan, why would that ever be a problem? Plants are good. They do photosynthesis. They remove CO2 from the environment. So that's good. But the problem is it can't be maintained. And also all those plants, right? They are producing oxygen, but if those algae and those plants die, who's going to work on those dead plants, right, after they die? Because they could just fill up a body of water with algae, and then there's no room for any other things to be in there because you have too much algae in that body of water. They die, right? When they die, decomposers work on them. Decomposers they have to use oxygen because they do cellular respiration, and they suck all the oxygen out of the lake. Now there's no oxygen for fish. Okay, and this is called eutrophication. Here, let me make myself a little bit smaller because I'm blocking that, and put that away. Okay, so this is a form of water pollution where you get these large algal blooms. So normal lake on the left, okay, eutrophication on the right. So you have a huge algal bloom. And when it's not the algae that are sucking the oxygen out of the water, but when they die, the decomposers are. And then as a result of that, there is no oxygen in the lake, and then this causes the death of the lake. So on your human activities, I gave you A already, that humans can dump large amounts of phosphorus into ecosystems, mining, fertilizers, waste runoff. Eutrophication is over-enrichment in bodies of water, and it leads to algal blooms, followed by an increase in decomposers, which can ultimately decrease what from the lake? Because remember what the decomposers are doing? They're doing cellular respiration, and that's going to require oxygen. So they decrease the oxygen content, and then they can cause a massive fish kill, All right, so 2 cycles down, we talked about the water cycle and how man can impact that, and we've talked about the phosphorus cycle and how man can impact that. So our next cycle is the nitrogen cycle. Now, some people think that this is a really, really hard cycle because it has lots of different organisms that are involved in it. But I think it's a super interesting cycle, and I think it's more than manageable for you to learn. Okay, I think it's a great cycle. So first of all, this is like the simple, very, very simple picture to help you understand it. So first of all, if you take a breath in and let it out, okay, 78% of what went in your lungs and immediately back out of your lungs was N2. That's nitrogen in the air. Our muscles didn't get any bigger, okay? We didn't get full. And the reason is we don't have a way to access N2 and use it, okay? There's no way. And almost everything on the planet can't do it either, right? There are some special organisms and bacteria that are called nitrogen-fixing bacteria, and they have the ability to take N2 from the atmosphere or in the soil, okay? And they do what's called nitrogen fixation. So they're taking it from a gas and they're fixing it into a solid. When they do nitrogen fixation, there still needs to be other bacteria called nitrifying bacteria, and they convert that fixed nitrogen as ammonia, okay? And then they will change it into something called nitrite. That comes first, right? Nitrite is NO2 minus. And then other nitrifying bacteria convert it one more time into NO3 minus. So it goes from ammonia to nitrite, ammonium, it goes to nitrite and then nitrate. Nitrates, NO3 minus, okay, that's what plants can use. And there you go, right? Then it gets into the producers, and then heterotrophs, it can get into the consumers when you eat the producers. So that's how we get it into our biotic community. So if you look right here, when you see what, the clouds up in the air. So you have to get it into a form that can be used by plants, and then animals can eat those plants. When the plants and the animals die, decomposers put it back into ammonia in the soil. All right, so let's go a little bit deeper on that one. Okay, let's take a look at this picture. So starting over on the left, you can see nitrogen fixation. That has to happen. And then that's by bacteria. Okay, and they get it into ammonia. And then nitrification is getting it into what's called nitrite and nitrate. Okay, and then that can get into plants and then animals, like you can see up here. Oh, let me get a pointer, sorry. Okay, so then that gets into plants, and then animals can eat those plants. The plants and the animals die, decomposers, and they get it back into ammonia. And then it can go through nitrification again, go back into plants, into animals, decomposers work on them, back to ammonia, and then back into nitrite, nitrate. Now there's a new term on here, and this is called denitrification. And this is how you get nitrogen back up into the atmosphere. Just like there are bacteria that take it out of the atmosphere and make it a solid, you can return it back into the atmosphere by denitrification. All right, so let me show you, let me remove those orange big ones, and let's take a look here once again. Okay, take a breath in and out. Okay, here we go. So we have N2 in the air, right? We have nitrogen fixing bacteria, and some of those live in little nodules in plants in a symbiotic relationship. And then some are just here in the soil. They are doing nitrogen fixation. And if I were in, I'll show you a little song to remember this, because if I were in class, we would go nitrogen fixing bacteria, and they're going to take N2 from the air and they make it into ammonia. I go like this, like if I was scrubbing with ammonia, because nobody, we don't like ammonia to use or to consume, neither do plants, right? That would be toxic. So I think like I'm scrubbing, okay, with ammonia. And then these nitrifying bacteria, they'll take this ammonium, nitrifying bacteria, and they first convert it into nitrites. That's NO2 minus, nitrites, okay? And then further nitrifying bacteria convert it into nitrates. And I always think of like tray, like I'm serving it up to plants. Nitrates on a tray, okay, serve it up to plants. And then those will go into the plants, and then animals can eat those plants, and then the plants and the animals die, and decomposers put it back into this ammonia, right? And then nitrifying bacteria can convert it to nitrite, and then other ones can convert it to nitrate, and it goes back into the plants. Cycle repeats. Okay. Now, From this nitrate, though, you could have denitrification, right? So you could put it back up into the atmosphere. All right, so let's get some notes down and then we'll go over this one more time, make sure we have it. So on your nitrogen cycle, you have the reservoir is the atmosphere, and 78% of the gases in the atmosphere are N2. Nitrogen fixation. So you can see bacteria, it goes from N2 to NH3. Now, there's another way that you can do this, okay? And lightning will do this. And let me see if I have a picture, and then I'll come back to this one, okay? Lightning can do what's called atmospheric fixation. So this is like, and it will go directly from N2 to this. What was this? Do you remember what this was? Nitrate. So it goes from N2 directly to nitrate, lightning, and that's called atmospheric fixation, and that's in your notes as well. And then a third way is through industry. So industrial fixation, like when they're making fertilizers, all right? Nitrification, and we need to keep these terms down. Nitrification, look right here. This is when you take the ammonia and first it goes to nitrite, NO2 minus, and then more nitrifying bacteria and it goes to nitrate, NO3 minus. And that's what plants can use. So on your nitrification, look at your notes. Bacteria convert NH3 to nitrite, first nitrite, and then nitrate. Plants incorporate nitrate into their body tissues, then it can go to animals, right? And eventually to decomposers who return it, this is the part you want in your notes, return it to ammonia in the soil. Return it to ammonia in the soil, okay? Denitrification, okay, what that is when bacteria that convert nitrate back to N2, and it goes back into the atmosphere. And it's the opposite of nitrogen fixation, the opposite of nitrogen fixation. All right, so let me try. Okay, there we go. Let me do this, back up a little bit. So we can do it as kind of a little song that we can do, right? So we can remember the nitrogen cycle. So this is the nitrogen cycle, and it starts with N2 in the air, and you're gonna grab that nitrogen, right? And you're gonna do nitrogen fixation, and that's by bacteria, and you form ammonia. So you form ammonia. So it goes from N2, grab it in the air, nitrogen fixing bacteria, convert it to ammonia. And you do nitrification by bacteria, right? Nitrification, first nitrite, then nitrate. You can serve this nitrate up to plants. So now we're a plant, so now it's in plant bodies. And then you can have heterotrophs eat the plants, okay? Then the plants and the animals, okay, they will die. And when they die, decomposers work on them and they put it back into ammonia, right? Then nitrite, then nitrate, and it's back in the plants. Animals eat the plants, right? And then the animals and the plants die, decomposers back to ammonia. Now, nitrite, nitrate. Another way you can get this nitrate, right, is it can be, you can form it through atmospheric fixation. Also through industry, you can form nitrate. And then to return it back out to the atmosphere, we do denitrification and we return it back to the atmosphere. All right? And we'll go over that little thing in class too, and hopefully that helps you. And you're like, oh, Mrs. Sloan. All right. Okay, so here we go. So we talked about that. And one other note on here. So when you do, and you do atmospheric fixation, when you do that, then you can have issues where it will dissolve into the rain when it forms out those nitrates, and it can be carried to the earth, and that can be one way that you can have access to it. Take a look at this picture. This would just be a little review. I actually got this picture from like an oil and gas company. Okay, so, but this one should be easily understood. You could like screenshot this and put this in your notes. If you need a little help with it, look right here, reservoir, and let's look at all the different ways that you can fix it. Nitrogen fixing bacteria. This would be industrial, forming fertilizers. And on the outermost one, we have atmospheric, right? So the nitrogen fixation, right, by nitrifying bacteria, right, by lightning, and then industry when they form it. Then as you see down here, you can see we've got ammonia, and ammonia by nitrifying bacteria can be converted to NO2 minus, then other nitrifying bacteria can convert it to nitrate, or it goes directly to nitrates by lightning or industry. Once it is as a nitrate, then it can move into plants, then animals can eat those plants, right? Those plants and animals can be decomposed, their waste can be decomposed, and it returns back as ammonia. Another way it can move is you can use denitrifying bacteria, right, which return it back out to the atmosphere. So hopefully that has become easy peasy for you on that. Let's talk a little bit about human activities. This looks bad to me, okay? So on human activities, we have the production of nitrous oxides, that's bad, through fertilizers and the burning of fossil fuels, It contributes to acid rain, bad, okay? Contributes to acid rain, photochemical smog, thermal inversions. So here you can see all of these things are going to impact biodiversity when you change the pH of soil, right? So acid rain bad, here's another one for you, okay? It can damage plant tissues. Remember, we love those plants because they do photosynthesis for us. That's it. You've got that part, I'm sure. So we've done 3 cycles, right? We've done the water cycle and how man impacts that. We did the phosphorus cycle stored in rocks, and then we did the nitrogen cycle. So our last cycle we need to do is the carbon cycle. So take just a minute to look at this. Okay, so the carbon and oxygen cycle are very, very interconnected, right? So I want you to look, okay, look at these 4 items right here. Photosynthesis, respiration, combustion, this would be like of engines and cars, right? And decomposition. Okay, look at those. Now, how do they impact? Let's think about this. Do they generate oxygen? Of these 4 things, are they generating oxygen into our atmosphere, or are they generating carbon dioxide? Okay, because both of those are connected, right? So big picture, okay, in case this is, let me just go over one thing with you real quick, make sure you understand this, right? So all organisms do cellular respiration, okay? Some do it requiring oxygen. They do aerobic respiration. Multicellular organisms have to have oxygen to do cellular respiration. And basically what they're doing is they're breaking down sugars, and they're taking the energy in the bonds of those sugars or other nutrient supply, and they're converting it to ATP. And ATP is the cellular currency, right? It's our body's currency, how we do our reactions. So, and you know the powerhouse of the cell, right? Everybody knows it because the memes, it's mitochondria. So that will happen in eukaryotic cells inside the mitochondria, right? Okay, so cellular respiration aerobically requires oxygen. Okay, so we bring oxygen in, and then I'm exhaling what? CO2. That is a byproduct of it. So any organism that does cellular respiration, who does cellular respiration? All organisms, they're going to generate CO2 as a byproduct of that. When you burn something, like whether it's in your fireplace or in your car or any industry, the burning of something is just like how in our bodies we burn sugar. And so a byproduct, again, of burning something is going to be CO2 in the atmosphere, right? Decomposers, right? We need decomposers. That's a critical part, right, of our ecosystems, are decomposers, because they return nutrients to the exchange pools. Decomposers do cellular respiration, because all cells do cellular respiration. So again, putting CO2 out into the atmosphere. There is one process that removes CO2 from the atmosphere, that fixes CO2 into sugars, and that process is photosynthesis. Now, plants do, autotrophs do photosynthesis. And when we think about plants, right? Plants do, because all organisms do cellular respiration. What do you think plants do more of? Do they do more photosynthesis or they do more cellular respiration? Hopefully it makes sense to you that they do more photosynthesis, right? Because a byproduct of photosynthesis is oxygen. And because there's oxygen in our atmosphere, it's because the plants do way more photosynthesis than they do cellular respiration, because they need oxygen for their cellular respiration, but they have enough oxygen left over from all their photosynthesis that we can do cellular respiration too. And decomposers can do cellular respiration. Thank you, plants, for all the excess oxygen that you put in our environment. Okay, so that's like a little big picture overview. So now take a look at this, right? The only one of these four things that removes CO2 from our environment is photosynthesis. And we need plants to do that. So let's not cut them down, right? Let's keep our plants healthy. Because cellular respiration and combustion and decomposition all add CO2 into our environment. All right, so let's take a look at another picture here. Let me show you. Okay, here we go. Take a look at this. All right, so burning of fossil fuels, that's going to put CO2 in the air. Any form of cellular respiration, which all organisms do, that's going to put CO2 into the air. So there's lots of CO2 in the air. The only thing that takes it out is the process of photosynthesis. Okay, so on our notes for the carbon cycle, the reservoir are living and dead organisms. The exchange pool is the atmosphere. The exchange pool is the atmosphere. Photosynthesis and cellular respiration exchange carbon dioxide in water, and I already told you this water becomes bicarbonate. Now, human activities, you know where I'm going with this, right? Okay, all of this CO2 that's in the air, right? These are contributing to what's called greenhouse gases, where it's making our little planet like a greenhouse where the heat comes in, but it can't get out. And when it can't get out, it increases our global mean temperature, ice caps melting, salt water becoming more dilute in our oceans, weather patterns changing, #bad. Okay, so for human activities, more CO2 is being released into the environment than can be removed. Okay, and this is due to the burning of fossil fuels and the destruction of the forest. Why the destruction and deforestation of the forest? Number one, when you cut down forests to make more farmland because you don't have enough food, right? We can think about the reasons why that might happen, or you're trying to make more homes, right? The burning of those trees creates more CO2, and now you have fewer plants to remove the CO2 from the atmosphere. All right, so on that 3A, burning of fossil fuels and the destruction of forests. The greenhouse effect. Excess gases in the environment act like a greenhouse, allowing heat in, but it cannot escape. With the impact on our global mean temperature, and this is global warming, #bad. All right. Now, this is the end of this particular presentation, and we will debrief it in class. I just want you to remember you got 4 biogeochemical cycles, and they're all important. And as humans, we need to act responsibly with our biogeochemical cycles. All right. And yeah, that's all.